Okay, let's get started. Let me begin by introducing myself for those who might not know me. I'm Barbara Schreiner. I'm the Executive Director of the Water Integrity Network, and I would like to welcome everybody, wherever you are in the world and whatever time zone you are in the world. Thank you for making the time to attend this afternoon's Water Integrity Talk. I know that this is a busy time of the year. We're all frantically trying to get things finished before this year ends and the next one comes in. So it's great that you've been able to make time to attend the session on what we think is an incredibly important topic. For those of us in the water sector, for people concerned about water, we watch with, I guess, increasing horror the floods and the droughts that are affecting the world with increasing severity and impacts. And increasing droughts and water scarcity are of huge concern. In recent years, we've seen a massive drought in the Horn of Africa, millions of people facing extreme water scarcity. We had just 4.5 million people in Somalia experiencing crisis-level food insecurity in early 2025. We saw pastoralists and farmers lose their livestock and crops, large-scale displacement as a result, and deepening food crises. In southern Africa, the 2024 corn crop in Zimbabwe was down by about 70%. Maize prices doubled in a country that cannot afford doubled maize prices, and close on 9,000 cattle died of thirst and starvation. In Zambia, we saw the Zambezi River dropping to about 20% of its long-term average. The Kariba Dam operated at about 7% capacity, resulting in blackouts of up to 21 hours per day, affecting hospitals, factories, bakeries, and ordinary people. Huge issues of acute hunger across Eastern and Southern Africa. Turkey suffered its driest year in over 50 years in 2025, with severe drought and exceptionally low rainfall across most of the country. We've all heard the president of Iran talking about the severe crisis that they are facing, talking about evacuating the capital and moving the capital to the other end of the country. And in all of this, as water resources become increasingly scarce and unpredictable, as rainfall patterns are changing, water allocation, how water is shared between the myriad of users, becomes increasingly an area of focus. It's water allocation systems, whether it's permitting or other systems, become a critical element of adaptable water management. How on earth do we manage water in this rapidly changing environment, and how do we manage it sustainably and equitably? Are the systems we have currently up to the challenge? How vulnerable are they to exploitation, malpractice, and integrity risks? How do we reform our allocation systems and processes to make sure that we have equitable, transparent, and sustainable water management in a changing world? So this afternoon, we have 4 presentations, which I think are going to be very interesting on this topic. I'm going to quickly introduce the 4 speakers so that once I've introduced them, we can move through the presentations, and then we will have time open to the floor for discussion and engagement. So the first speaker is Jonatan Godinez-Madrigal, who has a PhD in water management and governance from IHE Delft and the Delft University of Technology. He's a lecturer on water transitions at IHE Delft and leads the Just Transitions Research Group. His work includes projects on water allocation regimes, valuing water, and computational models as controversial tools. This afternoon, he'll be presenting the results from an IHE 2-year comparative study of water allocation and rights, with detailed analysis from a group of countries, but in fact, it's a global study. He'll be followed by Fermin Reygadas, who also has a doctorate in water from the University of California in Berkeley. He's co-founder of Cantara Azul. He's a member of the Water Integrity Network General Assembly, and he is an advisor to the Water Defense Network of Chiapas. His work with Cantara Azul has received international recognition, including awards at the World Water Forums. Fermin has also served on the governing board of Berriozabal's public community water body and advised Mexican water commissions in Congress. He's an Ashoka Social Entrepreneur Fellow, and he's been recognized for his work in innovation and systemic change. Today, he'll speak on water allocation challenges in Mexico. Then we have Mohamad Mova Al'Afghani, who's an international legal advisor and scholar with expertise in the fields of water law, human rights, and environmental governance. He obtained his PhD in water law and governance from the University of Dundee in the UK, and he has more than 15 years of experience in policy development, regulatory reforms, research, and advocacy, and has a diverse array of publications in different areas of law. He's currently a lecturer at the Universitas Ibn Khaldun, Bogor, and director of the Center for Regulation, Policy, and Governance. We'll be speaking about water tenure issues in Indonesia. And then we have, last but definitely not least, Dr. Mary Galvin, who's worked in the water, sanitation, and climate sectors over the past 30 years as a practitioner, an activist, an academic, and a consultant based in South Africa. She has served as WIN's research lead in Berlin over the last 2 years and is also leading our Bangladesh program. And she has a passionate commitment to issues of social justice and equity, and she'll be talking about the research that WIN has been doing on integrity in water permitting. And so on that note, I think we've got like a star panel to talk this afternoon, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Jonatan. I hope he's with us. Jonatan,
yes.
Are you there? Yes.
Yes,
great.
hello. Yes, I'm here. Yeah.
Excellent. Over to you.
Yep. Thank you very much, Barbara. Yes, so good morning, good afternoon, or evening to all participants, organizers, and all the listeners of this webinar organized by the Water Integrity Network. Thank you very much for this invitation. I gladly accepted on behalf of the colleagues from IC Delft, University of Amsterdam, and Wageningen University that composed the research project Water Allocation and Rights. Our project started in 2023 and conducted exploratory research in Spain, the Netherlands, China, Jordan, Chile, Mexico, Indonesia, and Australia, just in depth, but then regarding just like the legal framework, it is indeed a global study, a global research. So all these countries, we wanted to research them in detail because of their distinct social and environmental context, to investigate their legal frameworks and water rights and water allocation practices. So in that sense, my intervention draws from these multiple case examples, which show something that is, I think, dearly needed in the discussion of water allocation, which is perspective, no? Because then everybody sort of thinks that their case of their country is special, is unique, but then what we show is that no, like there's patterns emerging. No, so what we have found is that across the world, water allocation has moved from being a background administrative activity to one of the most defining water governance challenges of these times. Water allocation is no longer just about matching supply and demand. It has become an arena where societies negotiate sustainability, justice, economic prosperity, and climate resilience all at once. So specifically, researching about water allocation regimes understood as this consolidated set of practices that integrate social interests with specific technologies or legal frameworks, whether derived from land ownership, historical precedents, or administrative permits, are deeply shaped by institutional, social, political, and climatic path dependencies. So allocation regimes were often designed decades or even centuries ago in the case of the Netherlands or Spain, under very different hydrological and social conditions. Many still reflect some land-based rights, colonial legal legacies, or fragmented authorities. But when such systems are suddenly expected to mediate intense competition among agriculture, cities, industry, ecosystems, and in the context of extreme hydroclimatic variability, they just buckle. So officials tasked with making allocation decisions, they need to navigate a complex landscape of competing demands, economic pressures, hydrological uncertainty, community expectations, limited budget in many cases, economic pressures, hydrological uncertainty, etc. No? So then in such conditions, integrity, because I try to think of integrity, how it fits in a research, is that the risk to integrity flourish because the rules, the incentives, and the information flows, they often fail to keep pace with today's realities. So then The pressures driving this shift is complexity for water allocation regimes are profound. So rapid population growth, economic expansion, land degradation, climatic change, they all have dramatically increased the demand for water, even as hydrological patterns become far more erratic. So just to give an example, by mid-century, nearly 60% of the world is expected to live under water stress from only 16% in 2010. So a transformation that is already forcing users into intense competition in many places on sustainable levels of extraction. So in such conditions, existing allocation systems are increasingly unable to deliver fairness, efficiency, or sustainability. So what once worked more or less reasonably, under relative abundance, now proves really fragile under limited water availability and a shift of societal priorities. So we think that it is crucial to recognize that integrity challenges in water allocation do not arise only from individual acts of corruption, which are, to be honest, omnipresent in almost all countries, but that integrity challenges emerge from systemic vulnerabilities, which are opaque decision-making, unequal access to information, regulatory capture by influential actors, mismatches between statutory and customary systems, and reforms that generate unintended and sometimes even harmful effects. So we need to understand that these are the emerging properties of institutional design of water allocation regimes struggling to function amid rapid environmental and socioeconomic change. So in our research, comparative insights show that countries rely on a broad repertoire of instruments to organize water allocation, to what my colleagues and I call the 3 Ps, so permits, pricing mechanisms, and platforms. Each of these comes with its own logic, benefits, and risk, but more than that, each institution shows that it is capable of designing systems of what we also call double realities, which is institutions that appear robust on paper, but do not govern behavior in practice. So permits, in the first place, they offer, of course, clarity and long-term security, but can also lock in historical inequalities or become ill-suited to fluctuating water availability. In many countries, the right systems grew out of repairing traditions or historical concessions that still anchor today's entitlements. Such arrangements can create what we call the de facto quasi-property rights, so which are long-duration water rights with broad transferability under weak conditions. So they hinder the state's ability to reallocate water under new realities of limited water availability. So attempts to reform these quasi-property rights are often resisted by entrenched user groups who perceive new regulations as expropriation. Meanwhile, indigenous and customary water rights along marginalized communities are now demanding recognition, adding more complexity if possible, but also greater legitimacy to allocation regimes. So formal permits may exist on paper, but weak monitoring, inspection, and enforcement, poor data, political interference, informal arrangements, they often undermine the real outcomes. So this mismatch creates really fertile ground for illicit abstractions, selective enforcement, speculative accumulation of rights, opaque reallocations during droughts. Now the second P, pricing, market-based instruments, they promise efficiency and can help reallocate water quickly, but if without oversight and transparency, they can lead to water hoarding or speculative behavior. The third P, platforms, which are multi-stakeholder arenas, water user associations, for example, they can build legitimacy and create a space for local knowledge, but in many cases, like Mexico, Jordan, South Africa, China, Indonesia, they reflect different levels of misalignment between mandates and practice, sometimes creating what is called like empty institutions, systems that can exist only nominally, leaving users uncertain and reproducing power imbalances. So, and I'm almost concluding. So understanding this risk require acknowledging the lived reality of allocation officials. So they operate in environments where data is incomplete, budgets to monitor and inspect users are meager at best, hydrological predictions are uncertain, and political demands are urgent. So then they must make decisions that carry both legal consequences and social ramifications. And when institutions lack clarity or capacity, officials are often exposed forced to improvise, negotiate informally, depend on discretion. All these heighten integrity risk. This is why strengthening integrity is not simply about designing better rules, but it requires building systems that support officials with clear mandates, reliable information, sizable budget compared to the monitoring and inspection routines required, robust oversight, and legitimate participation processes. So I'm going to try to cut short because I think I'm already over time. So basically, we need to find ways to create water allocation regimes that are that can ensure equity, security, and sustainability. But then we need a lot of transparency. But also it's not enough. Also procedural and distributive justice is important. Communities must be able to participate meaningfully in decision making, and also to try to really have clarity on the safe and just boundaries for people and ecosystems. So then research aim not
Jonatan?
to provide. Yes.
Please.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, indeed. So then we didn't want to provide a bulletproof blueprint, but just to create a map of what is possible and how different countries are showing different paths for reform. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jonatan. And I understand the challenges of trying to capture 2 years of work into a couple of minutes.
Indeed, yeah.
But some really rich ideas there, and I for one am really looking forward to this study when it's published. I think there's some very interesting stuff in the difference between sort of the corruption challenges and systemic challenges of a system that is built and that cannot function because of the way it's been constructed and doesn't meet the existing realities. I think is some very useful framing. So thank you for that. I'm going to now hand over to Fermin.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm really glad that I'm presenting right after Jonatan, because then we can move into the global perspective, which I think applies really well to what's happening in Mexico. And then we can move into understand a little bit what is really difficult to understand, which is like you see a country like Mexico and you look at the economic level of Mexico, like second largest economy in Latin America. You look at a country that has academic institutions, that has federal and state institutions. And you wouldn't expect, to go into the field and see that in most cities in the country, you cannot drink tap water. Most rivers are just open sewages, and we have overused most of aquifers in the country. And so, and this is just not in technical terms. Hundreds of thousands of children grow with malnutrition because they're drinking contaminated water, and they have constant diarrhea. You also have women, children that when they go to school and they cannot have a decent place to go to the bathroom. There's no water in the schools, and many other problems that affect daily lives, health, and also that create and deepen the inequalities that exist in a country like Mexico. And when we try to understand why this happened, particularly thinking that 40 years ago, in most cities in Mexico, you could drink tap water, and tap water was safe to drink. And so why is the case now that we have developed, and created this deep crisis that looks really difficult to get out of it? And I want to point at two specific things that happened in the 90s and that created a system. And so from this system perspective, is that we have been entrenched in this system, and it has been really difficult to get out of it. And one of them was that Mexico transitioned into a neoliberalism a political approach, and in big part by signing a trade agreement with the US. And that in that context, Mexico created its national water law, which had the principle of like the market is going to allocate water in the most adequate and efficient way. And at the same time, there was an epidemic of cholera in America, in the Americas, in Latin America. And there was this big investment in infrastructure, which coupled with the investments that had been happening in the previous decades in building dams. And so these two conditions, on one hand, in terms of water allocation, the quantity of water being allocated, what if you like move throughout 30 years from the 90s to now, what you see is that when water allocation was left to the markets, first come, first served, people that had more and companies that had more power were the ones that were able to get their water allocation rights, and those who didn't or didn't have the resources to go through all the paperwork, they ended up without this water allocation rights. And at the same time, what was happening is that there was very little investment in building a strong regulatory agency of water allocation rights. And so what became the norm was over-extraction, pollution of water ecosystems without any consequence for water right owners. And even when in a country like Mexico, water is considered a national property. So it's a national property, it's not a private property, but it's through concessions is given to private entities. And these concessions became, as Jonathan was saying, like these permanent rights with that even if you were not meeting the requirements of those rights, you would still keep those rights almost forever. And in parallel to that, the institution was co-opted by like allocating the funding into large infrastructure projects that only benefit the politicians at the moment and also the companies that were building these projects, and transferring really all the costs to the cities, to local communities, and to people in general. And so the combination of these two, the neoliberalism approach and also putting the funding into large projects, meant that rural communities, peri-urban communities, like they ended up without water and also receiving only contaminated water in the cases where pipe water was available. And so this crisis has been recognized for almost at least 15 years, and it has been very difficult to get out of it. And the approaches have been to, within the system, try to come up with solutions. But the system is so co-opted by these mechanisms that it's almost impossible to get out. So what we have seen is that when a case like that occurs, you really need to look at the frontier, you need to look at the resistance. And in those cases, the solutions emerge, alternatives to the current models emerge. And in the conversation later, I would like to talk more about, for example, in central valleys of Oaxaca, how indigenous communities, understanding that the legal framework in Mexico was not on their best interests, they develop alternatives. And at the same time, in Chiapas, how community-based water management is emerging as a mechanism to provide safe water to 1/4 of the population in Mexico.
Fermin, thank you very much for that. That was also very interesting. And again, this issue of systemic failure and co-optation of systems, a really important one. And I like the idea that there's, in a sense, resistance happening at the margins, or alternatives coming from the margins. And how do those alternatives, is there a way of those actually coming in to fundamentally change the systems that are clearly not working, and certainly not working in the interests of the poor and the working class? So thank you very much. Some interesting challenges, and we will definitely come back to you for some more information on that. Let's move on to Mova and hear about what's been going on there around water tenure.
Thank you. Maybe we can put on the slide. Yeah, so this presentation is a part of FAO water tenure assessment conducted in the Chimanook River Basin, which is the second phase of the Water Scarcity Action Plan. So, but for this presentation, I'm going to just focus specifically on agency tenure. So tenure is the relationship, as the FAO defined, the relationship between people and water. and agency tenure are a type of tenure that is held by public or institutions which has a mandate under the regulation. Can we have the next slide, please? So why is agency tenure important? Because first is because we know that probably Indonesia is around 80%, but in other countries probably it's the same, that the majority of agriculture use is actually, the majority of water use is actually from agriculture. And so that most of these agriculture, except for some of the small rain-fed or self-supply, they rely on an irrigation network. And these network of irrigation are, of course, operated by the people who are guarding the water gates under the so-called agency tenure. In Indonesia, for example, the majority are protected under de minimis use, so they rely on irrigation channels, but they are really at the mercy of people guarding the water gates. So we can see that there are different kinds of tenure here being mapped on the matrix, and agency tenure is one of them, in addition to permits and licenses and other mechanisms. Next slide. So I would like to zoom in into the kind of irrigation network. This one is in the Chimanok River Basin, in one of the irrigation area, in one of the national rice, what called the national rice production areas. So our research is zoom in this river basin area, and we are zooming in on the red box, which is the left and hand side. And you can see the dots here. These are the water gates that are guarded by, well, they can be opened and then closed and then directed and redirected. And we can see in the most left-hand side is the dam. Then we have the primary irrigation channel, and we have secondary up to the tertiary irrigation channels. These are quite large irrigation areas. This is in the Chimanok River Basin and located in West Java in Indonesia. Next slide. So what happened with the agency tenure? Well, the people who are guarding the floodgates can actually decide which area gets flooded and which area don't get flooded. So this is from our fieldwork, in which the region is actually protesting, why do the fields why is it some of the fields get flooded and they receive no compensation for them? Why is it not that the other area gets flooded? Of course, this is difficult sometimes because this is in the brink of a moment that there is big flooding and they have to divert the water somewhere. But what is actually the rationale, for example, in flooding one area against another? That's something that we need to really look for. Next slide. Now, this is another interesting thing. This one happens on the third and second planting season, which is during drought. We have when we have rainy season, it's fine, but during drought, water is actually scarce. So we received the news, according to the farmers, that there are water mafia operating in the midstream, and then people can pay around 30 million rupiahs per village in order to for these floodgates, for these irrigation channels to be directed to their villages. And so this is happening for some time. So you can see here in the picture that there are farmers in the downstream complaining to us that we haven't received a single drop of water because we are supposed to receive it under the allocation scheme, but there is nothing here. So they're just waiting for the gates, waiting for their schedule, because the allocation is made by schedule, but then there is no water coming out. Where does the water go? We're supposed to get it. So they're blaming this so-called water mafia. Next slide. So we triangulate the findings. So we interview the farmers. Some said during the meeting, so the terms water mafia is coming from them. Some approach us during lunchtime, but we also interviewed the government officials and also at the River Basin Organization, and they do acknowledge that this exists. After 1 year, we conducted another validation workshop, and it seems that the situation have somewhat improved. Some areas which were not irrigated in the third planting season, they can have 3 times harvest, so it means that they get irrigated. And also that the River Basin Organization is taking over some of the operations from the local government, which are suspected to have some people colluding in the midstream. Next slide. So this is my final slide. I think the things that can work here is first they rotate the gate officers every 6 or 12 months, because when you stay in one position longer, then you will accumulate power, for example. And there is no home area posting. You live in area A, you don't get posted near that water gate because you probably know the locals and then build the networks and so on. And then separating between the recruitment unit and the supervising unit. And then this has not been conducted, but I think it could be conducted by using smartphone photos and documentation with timestamps. The River Basin Organization also established ethics boards, the RBO, and then there is also reporting of violations, and then they also completed complaint mechanisms for the officers. But the whistleblower protection, I see, is not there yet. So I think this mechanisms is very, very central and very important if we want to tackle the problems of accountability in agency tenure. Thank you. Back to you, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Mova. Very interesting. I mean, I think we started with a discussion of power from Jonatan, including the power around how systems are developed and whose benefits they're in, threading through Fermin's work, and now power of who opens the gate, and how it affects. So yes, this is not a technical issue. This is a social, economic, and very much an issue of power relations. So thank you very much for that. And our last speaker, I'll now hand over to Mary, and then we will have plenty of time for discussion.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm so keen to hear what everyone has to say about these presentations. It's hard to go on with my own. We heard at the beginning about the devastating impacts and the widespread impacts. I don't want to speak to that more than to say that, more than to say that I'm having a hard time here.
We can see your opening slide.
Okay, am I doing it? I think, okay. So the first slide.
Second slide, yeah.
Okay, we're there. So the 2 to 3 billion people who are lacking access to secure water sources, water shortages, that's going to be exacerbated with climate change. And so the greater need for effective water allocation systems. And I'm glad the word power keeps coming up here. One of the urgencies is to avoid conflict and to address some of the power imbalances. Next slide. So this research is about the question of what are the key integrity risks in water allocation systems and what new challenges are emerging as a result of climate change. We did this project, or we're doing it with the support of GIZ. It'll be a WIN working paper. You can see we're sort of shifting and taking on a slightly broader viewpoint in WIN from services into water resources. So this is one of our first entry points. And the sub-questions that we're looking at are about systemic levels. That's been spoken about and mentioned. I'll go into more detail with the integrity risks there. In administering and managing water allocation systems, we're looking at the permit system in particular because it's widespread when it comes to the administration question. But we know that the communal systems are so prevalent all throughout Africa and Latin America that that's certain to be our next working paper and does require a lot more consideration with integrity risks. Next slide. So this is just a very simple demonstration of what a number of you have emphasized about the importance of country context. As part of the research, we spoke to the 3 people here, and then another 10 people, all experts from different countries. and hearing again and again how particular things are to a country context, how it's embedded in political, economic, social realities. But then, as Jonathan was saying, also seeing that if you take a step back, there are these similar dynamics, and in particular with integrity, which is what we are looking at. Next slide, please. So one of the starting questions was what the integrity risks are in water allocation systems. If you are looking at as a system as a whole, what is actually, where are the integrity risks? So if you look on the left-hand side, developing policy could have policy capture and lobbying by powerful groups, or the second one, developing legislation and regulation, could be collusion between government officials or politicians and powerful interest groups about drought rules. Or managing water allocation systems, we know often there are unclear roles and responsibilities that can be taken advantage of in this process. And then a final example, in assessing water availability, there can be manipulation of data. So some of these things are evident, some are less evident, but here are risks in water allocation systems. Next slide, please. This is a broader conceptual question, and I think it's already come up in the issue of sort of empty institutions that someone referred to. There are two ways that you can have systemic integrity issues. It's of the system. It's not in the system, it's of the system. So the logic is that if the container is rotten, the contents can be in good condition, but it doesn't serve the purpose. So two examples. One, if you have a system where even with exemplary implementation, it cannot produce an equitable and sustainable outcome, that's a systemic integrity issue. Or secondly, if the system itself cannot be implemented, it inherently lacks integrity. So those are two sort of higher level integrity questions that I think have run through some of the presentations. Next slide, please. Procedurally, there are integrity issues. And one of the things that we keep ending up talking about in the office is whether something's an integrity risk if you can't actually prove that it's deliberate, or can you prove intention? So, for example, system rules are designed to advantage certain groups. The first one, you can guess that would be, if it's designed that way, that has intentionality. Historical entitlements we're all aware of that are locked in. Are there procedures to try to adapt or to change those entitlements? The formal procedures that exclude groups from participating in processes, or lots of requirements to obtain a permit, which basically undermines communities' rights to use water for commercial or livelihood purposes. So those are national issues. You'll notice that I've completely skipped the transboundary discussion. I'm cheating, I didn't have time. Next slide, please. And so then when you get even more specific with the permit system, and I know the starting point for a lot of people here is questioning the permit system, but to just go ahead with that, you have this whole route, all of these steps that have to do with integrity risks in issuing a permit. So in terms of a technical analysis, there can be that the data is falsified or not made available, or there are bribes for submitting or reviewing applications. In the first two of these, bribes can run throughout these. Developing permit conditions or final permit decisions can be undue political influence. I heard about that in almost every interview of the officials and or leaders coming in to demand that a lower level official put a permit through, make it happen. So all of the different aspects of integrity run through all of these. Compliance and monitoring, definitely. it was interesting that when interviewees were talking about all of these, compliance and monitoring came out strongly, the political influence and impact and the bribery, yeah, those came through, but all of these kept leading back to the bigger concept and the bigger questions that you're raising now about the system overall. Next slide, please. The next, on our part, we'll have the case studies written up and we'll have great recommendations. Next slide, please. Okay, so changes in water allocation systems. I think that for me, the mention of path dependency made me feel a bit sad and concerned. I was taken by the idea that it's often crisis that leads to radical change in institutions. So maybe that path dependency can be overcome with the sorts of alternatives we're talking about here. What I mean is that, can we have changes in water allocation systems? There were various things and alternatives that are coming up here with the hybrid approach that's been raised again and again by our Barbara here at WIN and by Barbara van Koppen, in particular recognizing customary and statutory law and its uses through collective permits and general authorizations, community oversight and local management with water user associations where conditions are right. And I think that the Oaxaca example is one that use that or is relevant to developing that, as I understand. And then the question is, in considering the broader context, is it possible to identify changes to water allocation systems and to support change processes? You know, we're talking about these more theoretically, but what does it actually mean to change these systems? I keep raising that with Barbara. What would this take? What would this take? And this idea that it's unusually slow, very difficult. What are really the directions for change that we see in this field? So to end with a question, thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary, and thank you for highlighting that the integrity in application of an allocation system versus the integrity of the system as a whole. And I think that, again, is a thread that we've been hearing through, that in fact, a lot of these allocation systems lack an intrinsic integrity in the system, let alone then in how it's applied. And you end with a question that takes us very nicely into opening the discussion now to the floor, which is, so what? So where do we go? Is there something we can do about this? What can we do about this? Now, I can't see hands from people on the ground. I mean, people in the session. So if you want to speak, please put your question into the question Q&A box. Just type it in. And otherwise if you put questions into the chat, we'll try to field them from there as well. I have a number of questions from what I've heard, but I'm going to try and behave myself and give space to participants first. And I want to Leon Hermans has said, thanks for the interesting talks. In the study presented by Jonatan, we worked with certain trade-offs and implementation dilemmas to recognize that any water allocation system has its limits and that implementation is never straightforward. One of those, for instance, was to balance the need for longer-term stability and security of water users with the need for flexibility and adapting to changing circumstances and accommodate new water uses and users. It would be interesting to hear how the other speakers think of these and other trade-offs. Are we correct to think that these are inevitable? Or, if so, what does it mean for water integrity? And I think that's a really interesting question. And I think that I'm not sure who wants to volunteer to answer that, but I'm gonna call on Fermin to tell us a little bit more about the community systems that you were talking about, and do they serve to address this kind of challenge between longer term security and flexibility? and what
Yes.
else do they bring to the picture?
So in terms of the trade-offs before going into the community's experiences, we're also seeing, for example, in the past federal government and this one, which have presented themselves as governments that seek a transformation and they want to move from this neoliberal approach into an approach that serves communities, especially those most marginalized. We have seen how they have to not only in the water perspective, not only tackle climate change, scarcity, contamination, but they also have to, because we shared two rivers and two watersheds with the United States, they also have to put into their equation the balance of power within the US. And also internally, these are, for example, governments with kind of a left political agenda, and they need to keep, in order to maintain power, they need to keep a certain balance with the industry, and they have conceded more rights than we were expecting to maintain growth in the country. So we definitely see that this is a very complex situation. Again, this reinforces that the change will not come from within, particularly again because in water transformation policy is likely to deliver the benefits more in the medium and long term and not necessarily in the short term. So it's very difficult for a government to make that transformation. And then moving into the specific examples, in the case of Oaxaca, communities, they had the water permits, individual water permits, and they saw how water levels just went down and they lost access to water. And so the permits were paper permits, and they did not represent any water at the end. And so that moved them into going back to their original practices of collective action and started to do reforestation, but also to do monitoring and enforcement of limited, like regulating the amount of water that they could extract. And within less than a decade, they saw water come back, and they were able to improve like the yields of their agricultural fields. Then the Water Commission came in and said, you need to get your permits. And they said, like, we don't want individual permits. If we move back to individual permits, we lose the capability of collective action. And when you have institutions that have been co-opted either by a neoliberal approach or by the entities that only seek to do large infrastructure, then those institutions don't really have any capability of regulation. And so they have been moving into asking for collective rights rather than individual rights. And even though in the Mexican Constitution, their indigenous people's rights are for natural resources are recognized, there has been a lot of resistance to move into these collective rights. They were able to achieve it only in a basic level, but that was kind of a strong step forward and move in the right direction. And this is where we see that we need to take this type of experiences and create public policies with them. And this is kind of, if we need to think, when we say we need to think outside of the box, it's important to move into this resistance process and then convert them into policies. And I think it's a good moment in order to institutionalize them, it's a good moment to look at the collective principles that were systemized by Elinor Ostrom and then many hundreds of other researchers, and in order to be able to achieve justice and sustainability in common pool resource management, specifically in water allocation, but also in water services. I mean, a pipe water service is a common pool resource, and we have seen again in the case of Chiapas that when communities, they face a lot of power asymmetries with authorities, but when they organize and they interact with other communities, especially when they represent hundreds of communities, they switch that power balance. And then there is the possibility of having public to community partnerships and organizations, and moving away from public-private partnerships that haven't really worked in countries that have weak institutional frameworks. We think that public community partnerships and organizations are are the ones that can transform like the power, where do the institutions respond to, and so these are the shifts that we see some hope, and that now the challenge is how do we replicate them and make them the norm rather than outliers.
Thanks, Fermin. Very interesting. I'm sure there are questions that will give rise to. But in the meantime, before we follow up on that, I'd like to put to Mova and to Jonatan the question of what did you see in your work that is working? Are there? I mean, Fermin has just given us an example of community-based processes that are shifting the game. Was there anything that came out in your research that forms a kernel of, look, there's a different way of doing it, and it's working? I don't know if either Mova or Jonatan or even Mary, sorry, would like to come in on this.
Well, in the many countries that we researched, what we saw and from the many different type of interviews that we had is that policy entrepreneurs are really important. No, policy entrepreneurs, they may spend perhaps a decade or even more than a decade to be able to take on processes that are really long and really hard. So then for example, in Mexico, what Fermin was talking about this water law that started in the 90s, and that it is after like more than 20 years finally getting a revamped, but then that reform is not really going as intended. Many people are not happy with it, but then it hasn't really properly underwent a real process with one person trying to embed many of the principles that you would say call for an integrity type of water law. But then, for example, in the case of Chile and Brazil, I thought it was super interesting, because then Chile, with what is regarded as the most privatized or the most neoliberal water law in the whole world, they were able in 2022 to have a reform to embed the human rights to water in that law. And then, of course, it's not perfect. Of course, it's having many challenges, implementation challenges. But then I was fortunate to be able to speak closely with the person who took on this big challenge. And then he started on 2014. And then he took this process of convincing everybody, even the extreme right politicians in Chile, to be able to convince them that they were not going to lose their right, but then instead they were going to build a system that is more robust, that is more just, and that this robustness and justice, it was also on their own benefit. So then in the sense of how to be able to make systemic changes, I think that the policy entrepreneurs are really important. Also in Brazil right now, the director is experimenting with water allocation practices. So they're going to basins where there's extreme scarcity, and then they are saying like, hey, we want to experiment in a new way of allocating water. I cannot really explain it right now because it's going to take a long time. But then there are countries that are already trying to do things differently, and that sometimes it takes like one person that is or a group of persons in the government to try to take on this big challenge, and then this challenge it just takes decades. I mean, it's literally something that takes a long time to convince people who are afraid of changes. So that's my take on that.
Thanks very much for that. I'm just for those who might not know, I'm a South African, and I was involved in government in the Ministry and Department of Water in South Africa for many years. And we wrote our National Water Act is 1998, and we were strongly influenced, or we were strongly influenced by Mexico and what Mexico had done under the Water Act. And it saved us. And Fermin, I understand you've got concerns about it, but it saved us from some worse excesses and mistakes than that we would have made without the Mexican experience. But the Chilean approach was being quite strongly touted by some of the international forces. And I must say, I'm very glad that we avoided taking the Chilean approach, which we all now know in retrospect was a mistake. Let's put it politely that way. Mary, you want to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to add to your example now, because I think that what was really important to me in the South African experience was also the level of openness. The openness. It was a discussion in the sector that people were taking on, and I was involved from the civil society. And it was incredible, the surfacing of what these tensions are, the dynamics are. What are we going to do? I know it's a unusual situation there, but I think that idea that the key role of individuals and having this sense of agency is what gets us through and makes the change. So I wonder if it's worth taking a step back, and as much as we think about the actual system, we think about how do you generate that kind of openness.
Thanks very much, Mary. Mova.
Thanks. I think the kinds of governance problem, transparency, accountability, it's the same problem with water allocation. The FAO have a tenure governance framework. Like, for example, we need to publish who gets what and at what schedules, what are the lists, and then what are the complaint mechanisms, and then trying to reduce their power and their monopoly of these officers, for example, concerning delegate, from that one single case study, which is not much. I think that some of them could work. But this is when we are talking about farmers against farmers water allocation, which is then during drought, people are taking advantage of the scarcity. But when it comes to sectoral allocation, let's say between electricity and farmers in the downstream, because the dam would need some headwater, some certain levels in to maintain for the generator to work. This is a bit more difficult, and I still don't know how to have a resolution on this. So, for example, they could decide to shut down the electricity, so not operating, but only operating for 8 hours. That has happened, in order to give the water for the downstream farmers, but at the detriment of people not receiving electricity somewhere else. But this is again an agency tenure problem. How are we going to handle this sort of trade-off during when there is not enough water in the dam for everyone? Yeah, we still don't have a resolution for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mova. I mean, critical questions, that issue. This is all about trade-offs. And the moment you get to the question about trade-offs, you get to questions of power and who makes the choices and who benefits, who doesn't benefit. And I guess that's a fundamental question about what we're talking about this afternoon, is the power politics of access to water. And there's a follow-up question that I will come to in a moment. But Jonatan, I see that you have your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to add something really quick, is that what you mentioned, Barbara, I think that is something really needed, and that's something that we were able to witness in researching all these cases around the world, is that there is a need of international cooperation and to be able to have a lot of knowledge exchange between different cases, because then they're super important, because what you can see only in the law doesn't tell you the whole story. Also, how these people were able to, for example, lobby internally in the same government, and to really make a water law happen despite all the difficulties, despite all the resistance. It's stories that need to be shared, so that other countries can also understand from this and learn from this. So then I just wanted to add that it's imperative that there's knowledge exchange about water allocation regimes and between officers. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely, and hopefully your study is doing that, and the water tenure, the FAO process that Mova is part of is doing that, and hopefully our report will continue to do that. But I just want to say, absolutely, though, that information needs to be shared. But at the same time, we need to go back to the point that was raised, I think, by Mary, which is that the country context differs. and you have to take into account what your country context is about, because going back to the reform of the South African water law, we had essentially the northern donors were very willing to bring to South Africa all sorts of experience that we could learn from, but we had to be quite critical about. They brought us the Australians, they brought us the Chileans, they did bring us the Mexicans as well, but a whole lot of it we just went no, it's not going to work, and we don't want that here. So you do have to be very critical about what you're learning from other countries and how it would work in the context that you're dealing with. But I want to now bring up a question from Barbara van Koppen, who says, thanks for these interesting presentations. The Special Rapporteur on the Human Right to Water clarifies the abstract trade-offs in terms of inevitably prioritization and puts the meaning of water for people now and in the future central. First, water for life, domestic productive uses and aquatic life. Second, water in the public interest. And third, water for economic uses and profits. What do the presenters think of this? And I think there are two questions there. The one is around, does that prioritization make sense? The other is, how is it used, and how does it play out in terms of access to water in the things that you've studied? I have Fermin and then Mova.
Yes, Barbara, I want to first react to what you mentioned in terms of that looking at the water law in Mexico was useful for South Africa. And I think the real challenge was in Mexico is how it was implemented. And it might have been very different from how it was implemented in South Africa. So in Mexico, when you look at the law, I mean, you might differ in terms of if it was well designed or not, but there's a key element that was not included in the law, which is how do you tie the investment of resources into regulation? And the law doesn't say anything about the amount of investment. So if you look at over the past 20 years, water permit rights have produced around between $1 to $2 billion US a year. That's $1,000 to $2,000 million a year. And only about $5 million a year are invested in inspection, supervision, and enforcing those water rights. So I haven't seen in my life like a business, an institution, or any other entity that manages resources that invest as little as this. I mean, when it's something as big that moves so much resources, you need to invest in it. If you don't invest it, you're basically saying, like, this water, you're basically privatizing water and letting anyone do whatever with that water, because it's guaranteed that you will not have the institutional capability of enforcing the responsibilities that come with the water permit rights. And the challenge in Mexico, and we have just gone through a reform. I mean, like last week it was approved after more than a decade of the reform that had to be made, and there's no, like, this is not addressed because the legislator cannot commit the amount of funding that needs to be put into that's a decision of the executive. And so you are breaking the way that water is supposed to be managed from access to its funds. And I think this is at the core. If we want integrity, if we want to move into achieving the human right to water, if we want to move into prioritizing water in the way that the UN water rapporteur has said, like, we need to incorporate decisions about tying funding to the human right to water. You know, it should be invested first in the places where we have more contamination, where we have less access to water. But if we don't put money into the question, we can design laws that look really well, but that are going to fail in our face. And just very briefly to the comment that the participant made, I think it's very important, you know, after 20 years of working from civil society to try to make changes in government, at the beginning, we put a lot of emphasis in technical and designing public policies. But we have learned that if you don't have the backing of the people with their votes, and in order to make a political cost to politicians and institutions, without that capacity to have political costs, then it's really difficult to move into these progressive and justice agendas that we have and that we share.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting indeed. Yeah. Mova.
Thank you. I think, responding to Barbara's question, I think the implementation is going to be quite challenging. For example, in Indonesia, there has been water utilities wanted to use some of the springs. And then they claim that, well, this is for daily household use. And the farmers say, no, this is for us. So are we going to regard the use of water by water utility of household drinking water, because they also sometimes supply the industry, or are we going to put the side on the farmer? And then the other thing is, what do we mean by subsistence? Because as a water allocator, as someone who is in charge of the dam or the irrigators, we cannot measure. We just release some water. Are they going to use it for subsistence, or is it something that is actually other than subsistence, so higher than subsistence? It's beyond our control. And the third is, it makes sense on the volumetric sense, but what about non-consumptive water uses, such as the example I mentioned earlier? Are we going to select between the trade-off between shutting down electricity or not releasing water to the farmer? Because allocations are made at the block level. We release water, we don't release water. We don't know whether the water that we release is going to be subsistent or more than subsistent. So it's the implementation, I think it's quite challenging. Thanks.
So Mova, you wouldn't have any problems with the principle, but the devil is in the detail of how you actually try and translate it into the real world.
Yes.
And that's yeah, I mean that is one of the challenges of allocation systems. You can put them beautifully on paper, but even with great integrity in place, they're not always that simple to put to translate into reality. And there are many examples of that difficulty. But as a principle, the idea of prioritization, I presume, would be one that makes sense. I have two. The one is a comment, and the one is a question. So the first comment is from Shah Nasir Kisro, which is that in Pakistan, 4,500 water supply schemes operated and maintained by community-based organizations since the 90s. Very clean work and accountable to communities. But the problem is in building the huge schemes. The solution, which minimizes corruption in the water sector, is to design small schemes for 1 to 200 households and the introduction of innovative technology. So that's just a comment from Shah Nazir. Noor Ahmed raises an interesting question, which I'm not sure is a water allocation question. It may be an infrastructure question, but I'd be interested to hear what panelists have to say to this. I come from Mandera County in the northern region between Somalia and Ethiopia. During the dry season, we lose all our livestock, and during the rainy season, we lose billions of liters into the Indian Ocean. Where is integrity placed in this? Does anybody, I don't know if we have any people who are experts in the region, but just conceptually, does anybody want to comment on Noor's question? Because if you don't, then I'm going to risk. And again, I'm not clear about the full context, Noor. But I would be thinking that there is an issue of lack of infrastructure, storage infrastructure. If there's billions of liters, if there's massive amounts of water that is there in the rainy season, and then nothing left for the dry seasons, or nothing retained for the dry seasons, this may well be an issue of lack of infrastructure, and that relates then back to the question of who's making the decisions about what infrastructure is constructed where in order to ensure water availability for people in the dry season. And that links back to the decision-making system and how poor rural communities are very often are the ones that don't get the infrastructure that is needed to help get them out of poverty. I see, Jonatan, that you put in the chat that there's a really good paper called Blinded Like the State on the case of Morocco. And I wonder if you would just like to talk to that a little bit, because your comment in the chat is very cryptic.
Yeah, okay, perfect. No, yeah, it has to do with the comment of Fermin about how different water allocation regimes, even with a good intention of having a real mechanisms to try to avoid overexploitation. So something that explains why some governments do not want to invest money in getting real monitoring is because they don't really want to have a real information. So then in the case of Morocco, it was really clear in that paper that they had a really good monitoring system, and then when they started to get information saying that the system was overexploited, then they immediately started to defund it. So then after being defunded, after 10 or 15 years, then it is really like who knows what is really happening in the country. So you can go on with the same practice of exploitation, because then you don't have any information. So then, you know, nobody can tell you, hey, your system is collapsing, you know, like then who knows? Yeah? So, but then it is on purpose. It's not something that just, you know, like, you know, it's not just that some administrator didn't know how to allocate money there.
Yeah, very good point. Where the funds are allocated indicates some very deliberate intent. And we shouldn't always assume that it's just because there isn't enough funding. The funding is going somewhere else, and often lack of resources serves corrupt or certainly non-integrity practices. Absolutely, very important point. There's a comment from Hilma Bosch, or a question. Procedurally fair processes do not necessarily result in substantive justice. Since the most vulnerable often lack the power or resources to assert their rights, procedural inclusion and participation as just processes can in fact perpetuate existing injustices rather than challenge the status quo. What do we need to get a real change and reallocation? I mean, you have a hand up. I think it's a legacy hand, but I might even call on you to answer that question. Who wants to say, what do we change? How do we have these fair processes, but in an unfair world? And so people can't access them. So what, other than global economic revolution, what do we do in the water sector? Because that's where we can function. What do we do to make systems that actually are procedurally fair?
I would say like we need to pay more attention into the power structure, and it's very clear, like in the case of Mexico, it's very clear that power was very top down. Power, you know, the president, the director of the Water National Commission, and also the big cities had a lot of power in decision making in the water sector. The industry, even also, you know, organized agriculture, big organized agriculture, especially industrialized agriculture, had a lot of power. And so I think it's important, you know, if it's important to have the kind of water integrity as a framework to work, but we need to, if we don't have strategies that shift power or that rebalance power, it's very likely that we will run into having like better laws, better rules, but in the end, with pressures that exist, they're always going to be cutting corners and not delivering results. And so I think we need more and more strategies to shift that power. And in at least in democracies, or you know, working democracies, we need to put water in the. We need to ensure that water is in the public agenda, and that when it arrives to the public agenda, it is not with like the short-term vision that sometimes happens in cities. Like we will not raise the price of water, and that becomes like the water agenda. We need to ensure that the public asks for more, not only water in terms of quantity, but also in institutions. I think, I mean, we have been saying in this conversation that it is not about the infrastructure, it's not only about the laws, it's about building institutional capacity. And so putting institutional capacity of water and how do we collaborate in water in the public agenda, I think that's critical. And for us, especially for us that we have worked in rural communities, we face a structural challenge of power because communities are dispersed. So it's very difficult for them to collaborate and to have enough power. And so creating spaces for communities to talk to each other, to elect their representatives with a non-political agenda, but with not political in terms of the elections, but with a political agenda to transform the system. And I think that's a key difference. And ensuring that institutions respond more to people. And I think that's where we have to move to.
Great. Thank you very much. Mova.
Thank you. I think we need to bring in more recognition justice, perhaps. In the water tenure, we recognize there are different kinds of tenure. There are customary tenure, there are tenure for biodiversity, tenure for the environment. I think this needs to be recognized before it is becoming allocated. And the other things that we need to be critical of course, is that licenses, I would say, not licenses, formal tenures in whatever form. It could be a contract, it could be a license, it could be approval. Anything that is legislated or created by the state can in fact actually is dispossessing. So they are dispossessing from other previously existing tenure by the creation of this formal tenure. Of course, then if you have this participatory justice, you can participate everything, but the rights itself is actually unfairly created, then you will not have that justice. So I think the recognition justice, recognizing what water is for in the environment and to what relationship needs to be done first before water is allocated. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm reminded of the comment that somebody made about we are creating quasi-property rights. But in many cases it wasn't intended, but that's what's actually being created, and the problems that are associated with that, and the dispossession that goes along with that. Mary.
Quick points. I think that for me, it has to do with really raising awareness of the people who are in power to recognize that some of their efforts to widen participation can't just be tokenistic, that the claims that are being made about how people are engaged or small users are engaged, that those need to move past those general approaches and be under real scrutiny. And I think for me, the other point is if we're talking about alternatives and it's turning towards developing something new, it's hard to deal with the old stuff. And we want to do that, but the new things to not romanticize it. You know, I think the point is really well taken about substantive justice and needing to pay attention to that. So there's a tendency to romanticize the local solutions. Yeah, so for me, a lot of thinking, awareness, and having open discussions with people who are allies, with people who don't have power, who really don't have power, which means going out and speaking to people, not expecting them to come to a air-conditioned conference center miles from where they live. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, and I have some comments and questions. So Leon Herman says, thank you, Barbara, for bringing in the other Barbara, that's not me, for bringing in the special rapporteur on the human right to water, who has made some important and useful reports. I think this prioritization is quite widely accepted and also visible in laws and or policies in several countries. However, this is not sufficient and does not solve all the water allocation questions. For instance, in the Netherlands, a lot of river water is needed in dry periods to maintain dike stability and freshwater ecosystems in the low-lying west of the country to counter salinity. This water benefits all the priority levels, but also allocates water to a certain part of the country, meaning it is not available elsewhere. So I agree with the speakers that the translation of principles into practice still introduces further trade-offs. Yep, can look really good on paper. In the real world, it becomes very difficult. A comment from Monica Sons. I would like to point at the importance of supporting better capacity building among institutional actors that can ensure fair and just water allocation. This is my experience in Colombia. Policies are essential, but we forget to empower people. And I think that's a very valid point. And I think there's different people that need to be empowered. There's the community that Fermin was talking about, but there are the institutional actors who have to implement the legislation and the policy, who often do lack capacity. But I also think we need to recognize that where there is systemic corruption or systemic power imbalances at play, quite often institutions are hollowed out deliberately, and not it's not an accident. And it's the same that I think Mova was talking about, where the money goes. Sorry, it was Jonatan, that for example, monitoring is not funded. Sometimes it's a problem that there isn't enough money, but sometimes it's deliberate in order to enable lack of integrity in the processes. And then I've got a comment from Shana there. Decentralization and vibrant regulators are the two small solutions to raise integrity in the water sector. And then final comments from Barbara van Koppen. I think the prioritization by the special rapporteur differs from usual prioritization in laws. The latter is based on single-use sectors, denying significant intersectoral differences. Also, national ranking is at the national level, ignoring that local contexts are very different. The special rapporteur prioritization also challenges the first and right doctrine from the Western USA, when we know about that doctrine and some of the problems there. Yes, that was my introduction to Barbara's comment. Yes, agreed that general interest needs unpacking, for example, in bottom-up nested waterscapes, an issue to further unravel. And she asks Fermin if you have documented your case, and if so, whether you could share it. And I see, Fermin, that you have your hand up, but what I'm going to ask at this stage is for each of the panelists to make a 1-minute closing remark. What's your takeaway and your wisdom for the people who are in this session with us? Fermin, over to you.
So just something with this, sorry. Got it. In about 6 years ago, we were working in trying to design a new version of the water law in Mexico, and we were trying to harmonize it with the indigenous rights to manage their resources in their own territory. And there was this huge resistance that said, like, you know, how can they decide how to manage the water if they don't have institutions in order to do that? Like when we have a national institution like the Water National Commission that can do it better. And I was like, this type of comment, it doesn't stand when you look at all the ways of looking at how we're doing in water in Mexico. We have these dramatic failures, and so I think what is critical is that people that make decisions, they live the consequences of those decisions. And that's one of the, I mean, without romanticizing community-based water management or local institutions, when an institution has this capacity to, not this capacity, but this feedback loop that the decision that you make is going to deliver consequences to you, then you create an element of democracy that is very important. And it's the capacity to make mistakes and then correct them. And so I really think that we need to transform the ways in which we manage water, and we need to do not go into very technical or academic discourses that remove power from the people that are going to face the consequences of these decisions. And so that will be kind of my final point, that in order to build integrity, we need to build in this type of feedback loops that are really important.
Great. Thank you, Fermin. Mary.
Mine would just be a very general thing, that I'm once again reminded of the importance of individuals and being able to question, challenge, think, shake things up. And I think that beginning to identify those individuals within country and in groups that we know is important. I've heard lots of good, solid thinking, experienced people, same as the interviews, but it sometimes becomes a shame because it feels like we're talking to each other. How do we move past an integrity talk to a regular searching conversation so there are specific policy suggestions? And yeah, eager for the future with such good ideas. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Jonatan.
Yes, I would like to back up Fermin's final idea, but I would strengthen it by saying that also in Mexico there was this case, this black swan of something that shouldn't have happened in the history of the world, but it happened, which is that a local community was able to stop a huge infrastructure by the Mexican government, and they did it through an alliance based on a technical capacity that was not initially there with the communities, but then it was provided by universities. Then there was a legal capacity also by public defenders that you just wanted to give their time in order to give a good trial and a good legal defense to the communities, and then an amazing communication campaign. So then in order to be able to really put down justice or to make justice reality in case of water allocation, then we need strong communities, and these strong communities, they need allies, and they need technical allies, they need legal allies, they need legitimacy allies. So then they need to, or we need to start building an international network that can support in different dimensions the work that many communities are doing in order to be able to fight the prejudges, as Fermin mentioned, and about like, okay, these indigenous people, what do they know? So then I think that we need to also have action research a lot in academia to move away or to move further away from just talking to each other. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Mova.
Thank you. I think
1 minute.
we need to recognize and make things which are unseen to be seen. So going away from only the formal tenure, but recognizing different kinds of use before we allocate. Otherwise, then the structural injustice would persist because simply because we are ignored and not taking into account of the real water users are in the field. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And let me end. I am not going to try and summarize the discussion that we've had this afternoon. It's been far too rich and nuanced for me to do it justice by trying to summarize it. But I think we've heard some very interesting things around things that are working around collective action, collective management of water use. Certainly a recognition across the board that there are structural challenges that need to be overcome, and those are not overcome through amending the Water Act. There are different processes. Certainly legislation can support or undermine, but there are bigger processes at work here that one has to grapple with. And I would just support what Jonatan was saying, was that this conversation needs to continue, and it needs to continue in a way that we can generate ideas that really can work, because with climate change and the increasing climate change, population growth, economic growth, the pressures on the water resources, the way we're doing it at the moment is not where we can be doing it in 5 years' time. Things really do need to shift, and these discussions, the way people are thinking, we need to have a community that is thinking about these things and putting the ideas together and learning from each other, so that we can really do it better, so we can have systems that deliver water justice with integrity, with accountability, and that really serve the people who need benefit from improved water allocation. Thank you very much to the 4 panelists. Really, really useful and interesting input. Thank you to everybody else who's been with us, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.